Hi, my name is Paul Arnold. I'm often known as the Stuttering Professor. I'm a strategic planner, facilitator and trainer, amongst other things. And as you can see, I've read a few books in my time, and I have summarised over 50 business-related books for the help for other people. Today, I want to tell you about Grit by Angela Duckworth, and I'm sorry I've lost the cover somewhere, but you know, it's a great book. Look, the one line I give for what I think this book is about is success stems from grit. And grit is a combination of passion, perseverance and purpose to push on through the setbacks that we all have to deal with. Now, in a nutshell, the top line concepts, and then you can stop listening. Grit is regarded as a key factor for success in life. And grit is a mindset, it's an attitude of not giving up. And it gives us the staying power to push on through the inevitable trials and tribulations that everyone has, that eventually leads to mastery and success. Now, the author is suggesting, and I believe this, that grit can be learned, and it's very often imprinted in us from our parents and our culture. And, you know, we've seen so many films, you know, about people who persevere and keep on pushing, you know, and all that stuff. And we love the heroes of sport who come from, you know, being well down and they get up and they keep on going. We love that stories because it's so powerful story for ourselves. So we need to believe also that failures and setbacks are just part of the sort of normal learning curve that we have, and that they're going to help us grow in the long term. And the driving engine of grit comes from having a compelling purpose, a really important why, as Simon Sinek talks about, to make us want to get through those hurdles and keep up and keep on going. Another thing he talks about as a key to skill mastery is deliberate practice. This idea of, you know, small incremental steps of, you know, improvement every time. We learn a bit, we learn a bit, we learn a bit, and by doing that, we slowly inch our way forward. So let's dig into the meat of the book. Okay, so nice little story. At West Point, the US Military Academy, 14,000 students apply a year. But they only take 1,200 of them, so like, you know, less than 10%. But actually of those, 20% of them drop out before graduation, even after all the massive testing they've done to get from those 14,000 down to the 1,200. So the question they ask is, why did 240 fail? And the research showed the fundamental issue was they lacked grit. They lack this mental never give up attitude. So grit is a key factor behind many successful people in business, arts, sport, relationships as well. And grit is having that mental toughness to keep on pushing through, you know, the tedium, the tough times, the failures, the knockbacks, right? And the reality is that most successful people, almost every person, has failed before they become successful. And it was their tenacity and determination to not give up that led to their eventual success. And so successful people accept that there are swings and roundabouts. There is going to be the snakes and sort of ladders of life, and they don't give up. They just sort of accept it as part of the process. And they keep on going. And indeed, they sort of leverage the downers as motivators to push on through. You know, Princeton University, you know, did a really interesting study where they studied, you know, several thousand students for 5 years starting in high school. And from their studies, they isolated over 100 different traits that could influence performance, including personal background, socioeconomic status, IQ, etc. And one factor stood out as the principal predictor of success, and that was follow through, aka grit. Now, in the book, what Duckworth talks about is this idea of a talent versus effort. And she makes the good point that so talent is overrated. You know, it's but a small part of what ultimately drives our success. And it's the hard work to turn that raw talent into the achievement is where the most important work done. You know, so to go back to the 10,000 hours concept, you know, it's this idea, it's the hard work that eventually makes it rather than just the raw talent itself. A Harvard psychologist, William James, asserts, compared to where we ought to be, we are only half awake. We are making use of only a small part of our possible mental and physical resources. The human individual lives usually far within his limits, or her limits, obviously within a certain time. So, grit defines staying power, and it's the perseverance to a cause, to having your purpose being very clear. So whilst it's not a definite guarantee of success, we know that, to quote the Woody Allen thing, 80% of success is just showing up. It's doing the work and keep on going and keep on going and keep on going. In the book, she talks about how, you know, Darwin was a plodder, rather than being a sort of this inspirational intellect who just got everything right all the first time. But it was his love of his subject that kept him engaged longer than others. So he got to places that other people do because he burnt the midnight oil, you know. But the problem is we live in a culture that rewards natural talent, especially intelligence, versus the hard worker. So hence, you know, like, you know, Carol Dweck's book about fixed and growth mindsets. You know, and, you know, TV shows and sports statements, you know, celebrate, oh my God, you know, he's the latest brilliant star, child prodigy, all that stuff. You know, and actually organisations love to promote, you know, the youngest person on the board, he's a natural, she's a natural, you know, and actually what we've got to recognise is actually that it's less about talent and it's more about, you know, just putting the work in and keeping on going. And obviously the trouble with just focusing on talent is it just rewards 1% of people who are naturally born to be really good at something and disincentivize the 99% of us who are not, who literally do have to work hard to get to where they want to get to. So research does absolutely suggest that constant effort dedicated to one area is more influential on success than our genes. So let's now talk about dedicated focused effort. So excellence is achieved rarely in leaps, but small incremental steps gained from endless practice. The reality is that it's acquired greatness through dedicated long-term focus rather than so these big leaps, you know? You know, very few people are the Mozarts of the world, okay? Nietzsche once wrote, great things are accomplished by those people whose thinking is active in one direction. So if we want to excel, we need to focus and thus let go and deprioritize other things, because that gives us to put the time and the effort in to doing one thing really well rather than lots of things adequately well. It's everyone's choice, ultimately. And Duckworth came up with a very simple model, which goes like this. Talent times effort equals skill. Talent times effort equals skill. But if you want to get to achievement, it takes skill times effort. So notice you need effort to get to skill and you need effort to get to achievement. So in other words, in that equation, there's effort times 2. So in that sense, hard work really matters. We need to work hard to turn talent into skill. You know, and if you want to be really successful, you've got to work even harder than the next person. I love this quote in the book from Will Smith, you know, the Oscar-winning actor, who said, I can't do his accent. I've never really viewed myself as particularly talented. Where I excel is a ridiculous, sickening work ethic. The only thing that I see that is distinctly different from me is that I'm not afraid to die on the treadmill. I will not be outworked, period. You might have more talent than me, you might be more smarter than me, you might be sexy than me, but if you get on that treadmill together, there's two things. You're going to get off first or I'm going to die. It's really that simple. This idea, he's going to work it. Another concept, deliberate practice. People who practice more generally do better in things than others do. We've all heard of the Beckhams and everyone like that, you know, who go out on the football pitch, you know, an hour before others now, you know, practicing their passes, or Michael Jordan practicing his shots into the hoop. But it's not just about time on court or time in the field, it's the quality you do. So some people may have 20 years of experience, while others only have 1 year of experience repeated 20 times. We've got to learn every time. And therefore practice is much deeper than just the hours spent. It's more about the quality of those hours. The key seems to be deliberate practice. It's about having a deep reflective awareness of what's going on to make sure each session is purposeful. You know, very often in the rowing world, we're focusing on one particular aspect of the stroke at the time, and therefore we are just trying to get that better and better. At the end of every outing, we have a discussion about what do we do well, what we do even better at. That's what we're all trying to do. So it's about quality, not quantity. Rowdy Gaines, the 3 times Olympic gold medal swimmer, swam around the world in practice for a 49-second race. He swam around the world. The reality is that people who also swam in that final had also swum around the world. So he didn't win it based on the miles, he based it upon the quality of those miles rather than the quantity. A great psychologist called, I never pronounce his name correctly, so apologies, is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, focused on the state of high performance where the individual is in flow. It's a state of almost unconscious action where the body rather than the brain runs the show, and actions are effortless, there's fluidity, and it's more, it's more natural, and it's not a clumsy interventions from our intellectual brain. You know, people said, you feel as if you do not exist. My hand seems devoid of myself. I have nothing to do with what is happening. You know, and these periods of flow are intoxicating and addictive as we touch briefly a higher level of self. The next concept she talks about is passionate purpose drives perseverance. You know, Jeff Bezos, told Princeton graduates that if you're not passionate about what it is you're working on, you won't be able to stick to it. Because successful people love what they do and they really do it for the money, but for the intrinsic reward they get that brings them, and because that's what makes them excellent. They really love what they're doing, therefore they spend more time doing it than other people, and because they spend more time doing it, they become better at it. Yet in a recent Gallup poll revealed that more than 2/3 of people were not engaged in their work. They don't want to do it. So grit has 2 fundamental components to it. It's got passion and perseverance. And without the passion, you won't have the perseverance to keep pushing on through the monotony. You know, those endless swims that guy had to do were probably tedious, but he had a bigger goal in sight. And when he didn't win, he had to get back in the pool and go again and again and again because he had a belief. Now, a Stanford psychologist, Catherine Cox, analysed 301, I don't know why 301, exceptional achievers. And Cox found a leading trait of persistence of motive. In other words, persistence driven by passion. Passion and perseverance need direction to make them purposeful. That's why we need a goal to aim for. And without a target, the passion will be wasted. So we're getting towards the end now. So discovering your purpose, and there seem to be 3 classic steps to get to purpose. One is interest, because you enjoy the area, you spend more time doing it, so therefore you get to practice more. And because you practice more, you then move in the first place of purpose. You say, wow, I really enjoy this. I'm getting really good at this. Wow, there's a bigger purpose. There's, I can really do something with this. So that's what that's about, and then it becomes like purposeful because it moves from just a behavior to an identity. This is who I am. I am this runner, I am this swimmer, I am this whatever. And therefore it keeps on a much higher level of importance for us. Then we've got to talk about dealing with failure. And failure, we all know, trotted out all the time, failure is a key part of success. And progress rarely runs in a straight line. We learn more from our failures than we learn from our successes. Why? Because it makes us develop. When we're successful, we say, yeah, of course I'm successful, I'm good at this stuff. When we fail, we've got to say, what happened there? And you have to start thinking about that stuff. But, sadly, our culture trains people from a very early to have a negative experience of failure. We instill in them embarrassment, shame, sadness, fear. So no wonder so many people do not want to risk failing. You've got to go to the failure spot because only there are you going to find the other side of things. And we've got to have hope. As the phrase says, hope dies last. Hope is a critical factor of perseverance. It's about belief that things will get better, that by putting this effort, it isn't wasted. Hope makes us not give up. It makes us push on. And without going into, you can look it up, but, Seligman, a famous psychologist in the 1960s, did a very famous experiment about hopelessness and helplessness of putting dogs within a cage. I don't want to talk about the specifics of that because I don't want to upset people because rules were different in those days. But research has clearly shown that optimists have as many bad events in their lives as possible, but they choose to react differently. They change the meaning. They see the fallbacks as in a more positive way than other people do, and they don't hold it at an identity level. They hold it at a behaviour level. I failed there. That doesn't mean I'm a failure. Okay. And in a test, when pessimists were asked what reasons they gave when they failed to complete a task, pessimists tend to jump to permanent things they cannot be solved. Like, I always screw up. Whilst optimists often talk about transitory things like, I mismanaged my time, I was tired, so the way they talk about it is very different. And furthermore, research has shown that pessimists are more depressed, anxious, less gritty and give up, much sooner than others do. And in the long term, they're less successful in their career, life, relationships, health, finances, etc. I won't go into this too much because I've already done a summary about it, but, Carol Dweck talks, as I mentioned, about the fixed and the growth mindset, and this idea that we really do need to have a growth mindset where we're not seeing our talent to be sort of only about being innate. It's about how we learn that by working at something we grow. So the grit book is just another word for the growth mindset, about what that's all about. And obviously in the book that Dweck talks about, the growth mindset can be grown. And in this book, the grit can be grown. And we tend to learn a model from a very early age and they stay with us for a lifetime, but we can learn to react and deal with the stresses and downturns early on. How we're done, so you fall off your bike, you don't want to say, oh, well, you better stop riding the bike. You've got to get back on the bike again. And you've got to keep on pushing through, So it's how our parents react to the failures is really critically important, because that sets up for a process of being successful, and it's this idea about what's the locus of control. If we see ourselves to be the victim and believe we have little or no control of the situation, we move to a place of, as I said, Seligman's helpless and hopeless. However, we see the situation as transitory and we have some degree of agency of control, then it gives us the strength to keep on pushing through, So I think, the reality is that, certainly all the work as a psychotherapist is how we're raised and how we deal with setbacks in life become fundamental, and the very earliest times we need to have where we get used to those what are called optimal frustrations become really critical about our ability to learn to deal with grit. And that's why we've got all these, snowflake generations to talk about, because, children who have been highly protected, who have been told they're gifted and who have never experienced failure in life, have not yet learned how to deal with the setbacks. And these fragile, perfect, do not know how to deal with the setbacks, while some other people who come from much more less privileged backgrounds had learned that life doesn't run as easy as it may have done for some of these other people done. So what's the best way to go and breed, gritty children? And she talks about this idea, it's a mix of loving, supported but high standards. In other words, you're not going to be over loving, over supportive, and let them off stuff, and nor are you going to set high standards in a cruel, nasty way. It's the coming together of those things, of being compassionate and understanding, but still encouraging them to get back onto the book, and then goes on about, what we've got to do is, there's the encouragement. We should do lots of extra activities, because we've shown that if we are doing the music, the violin, the football, the drama, all these places where we're developing a skill where actually we will stumble is really important. So there are countless studies that show that, extracurricular activity, help fare you so much better in terms of your grades, self-esteem, behaviour, future employment, financial health, etc. So the trials and tribulations of developing an extracurricular skill, really help train our children in the mindset of perseverance and giving up in the face of failure. And then training effort lasts, okay? It's not just you learn it then and you forget about it. The psychologist Robert Eisenberger trained rats to press the lever for food. In one group, he made them work incredibly hard for the work, 20 presses before they got food. The other group, they just got a pellet after 2 pushes. Now, when they were then set other activities, the harder working rats demonstrated more vigour and endurance than the easy rats. So it gets learned behaviour. And using grit is a key criteria for job selection. As Microsoft, they used to give potential software pros a task that would be tedious and take ages to complete. And this was a test of their follow through to make sure that, they didn't give up. And I've seen that in quite a few other spaces as well, of really testing what is the mental aptitude of that people have. So let's talk about a culture of grit. The culture we live in and the culture we most identify will powerfully shape our beliefs, values, and hence behaviour. And what is a culture? A culture is an invisible psychological boundary that connects us, and it's the shared norms, values, and behaviours. And it's how do we do things round here? And when we adopt a culture, we take on those values and the behaviours of that culture because we want to belong. We want to identify with that. And eventually we embody that culture. And there's something like, I heard, it takes 70 years for that culture to become embodied within ourselves. Thus, if we want to be like a certain group of people, then we join that culture. We want to become a great swimmer, we need to join a great team. Likewise, if we want to increase our grit, we must join a culture that has grittiness at its core. And then their norms of performance and standards become ours. So, for example, when everyone else is getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go for a swim, it seems normal for us to do that as well. So, it's a good long book. Look, it's an easy book to read, written in a very conversational style. I found it to be, I'd say, light on real data. There is some stuff, I quoted some stuff, but it's not full of it. It's repetitive, and towards the end you think, finish the book, get out of here. And a lot of the evidence is based on correlations, and we know that correlation doesn't really lead to causation. So we've got to be a bit more careful about this stuff. But look, I still think the fundamental principle is right. This idea of, resilience, pushing on through is absolutely a fundamental thing that all of us need to have in our lives